Sir, thank you. Mr. Samuels, thank you very much for coming in and talking to us today, and congratulations on all your success.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
Now, what made you choose this particular topic, George Floyd?
So we had started, my co-author Tolu Olorunipa and I, we had started with a team at the Washington Post looking at how George Floyd's life was impacted by systemic racism. And that was supposed to be a one-time project, but the more we learned about George Floyd, the more we wanted to know about him. Because he was so dynamic, he was loved, he was beloved. And when you heard the fullness of his tale, not only did it humanize the tragedy itself, but it helped us really understand just how systemic racism can operate and change a person's life.
You're a veteran reporter. You've obviously seen a lot. You're also a black man living in America. But what about George Floyd's story surprised you, if that's a fair question?
There are a few things. The first thing was that George Floyd, like me, was a writer, that he'd spent a lot of time writing down things, his feelings, how he saw the world, and that was really helpful in helping us understand who he was. And the second thing was, if my parents had seen a person like George Floyd and I was walking down the street with them as a little boy, they'd say, don't be like that guy. He's not a role model. He's not someone you just aspire to. But we never really asked the question about how a person ends up in a position like that. And that's when we discovered that George Floyd, when he was a young boy, he was reading at grade level. He had these dreams of becoming a Supreme Court justice, but the world never saw him in that way. And it really forced me to ask the question, why is it that so many young black boys who have talent, who are brilliant, end up in positions like George Floyd did?
That's fascinating. It sounds like you learned a lot from your work doing this as well.
Absolutely. I mean, there are so many things that I kind of maybe knew on the inside, that when we did the research and we talked to not just people who knew George Floyd, but to experts in the field about healthcare and housing and education. We talked to people like the President of the United States. We talked to people who run government. And there are so many things that seemed curious in my life that made sense because of the work we were doing. Like one thing in Cleveland, for example, was, when I was growing up in the Bronx, we wouldn't go to the nearest hospital. We'd go to a hospital in another neighborhood. And through the research, we learned that that's not unusual for people who live in segregated neighborhoods, that the care that's delivered within those neighborhoods is often worse, and there are systemic, historic reasons for that to be.
Why do you think the book is resonating, or has resonated with so many people?
Well, first, I'm super glad that it does. I think one thing that surprises people is the actual depth of research that we had. It's based on more than 400 interviews, and it's a fair depiction of George Floyd. I think there are a lot of people who are nervous that we will just relitigate or revisit the tragedy that happened. But our book doesn't focus on the death, it focuses on the life of George Floyd. And because we focus on the life of George Floyd, that allows people to see themselves and that allows them to understand some of the large gaps we see in this country.
You touched on this, but what do you hope people take away from this book?
Well, the first thing I hope is that people understand that it's not just enough to see a person's name and think you know them, that we're all human, that we have flesh and blood, and that when we learn to meet each other on the human level and dig deep into what makes us us, then we see the connections between us. And the second thing that I hope people understand is that when we speak about systemic racism, it can feel like an academic exercise or something highfalutin. At the most base level, it can be an excuse. But we hope that when you go through the life of George Floyd and you see how different institutions that were supposed to help him often did not help him, then you can recognize that it exists and work to confront it.
The George Floyd case brought conversations across the country, new conversations, ones that people did not have before. In your mind, were these fleeting conversations, or are they lasting conversations? Are people still talking about it?
I hope they're lasting. But one of the most interesting interviews that we did was with Reverend Jesse Jackson. And I asked him, how do you keep hope alive? Because we're seeing the fervor about addressing systemic racism start to fade. That's where we are today. And he said that you have to look at the long arc of history to really understand how far we've come. So I think it's good to remember that even though things might seem a little dicey now, to consider where we were before George Floyd's murder and appreciate the progress that has been made.
What do you think America learned from the George Floyd case?
Well, I think it learned a lot. I think it learned the fact for a lot of people in this country that the things that people in low-income neighborhoods, like mostly Black people, were saying about their interactions with the police were true, that they weren't fictions or mythologies. I think people connected with understanding the brutality that afflicted George Floyd that day. The other thing I think America learned is that we can dig a little deeper. We can do a little better. It used to be that people would be able to say, well, we've come so far, but we got a long way to go, and have that be the end of the discussion. I think what George Floyd's murder helped America see was that there's an urgency to the battle for a fairer future.
And for you personally, what did it mean for you to win the Pulitzer Prize?
I've wanted to be a writer since I was a little boy, and winning the Pulitzer Prize was my biggest dream. It's been completely surreal to have that happen to me, but it's also more important that it happened for work like this. And it's our hope that having most people see the Pulitzer Prize as a fancy sticker on a book. And it's our hope that when people see that fancy sticker, they'll pick up the work, but also they'll pick it up to understand that these conversations about racism are necessary. They are uncomfortable, but they can be incredibly enlightening. And ultimately, we cannot get to the perfect place in our country if we don't have them.
Herbert Samuels, again, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Welcome back to Cleveland.
Thanks, I appreciate it.